Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. If you have viewed some of my previous videos, welcome back. This video should really raise an eyebrow. It did for me when I was conducting the research. Okay, so this video, as you can see, is titled Prominent Americans You Assumed Were White. How many times when recording or listening to someone speak about history do we assume that that person that they are speaking about is white, just based on their title or position? Oftentimes we, including myself in the past tense, usually assume that the individual is white. This is not a coincidence. In my opinion, this is due to the fact that we as Americans have been conditioned to believe only white people, for the most part, have accomplished anything of importance. How often do we pay attention to historical figures' appearance? I know that while doing research for my videos, there were many books, articles, and newspapers that totally skipped over what the person looked like. In my opinion, this means you don't get a complete description of the person. Another factor, and this is a glaring issue, does the painting, photo, or etching even resemble the written description? Now, I've also come across many books, articles, and newspapers that do have a physical description of the person, but for some reason, these pieces of literature don't make it onto the high school or college course reading list. Although, on the occasions when they do appear on the reading list, and the subject has a shallow or light, tawny, brown, olive, dark, swarthy complexion, the darker complexion gets explained away as the person only having dark hair or eye color or both, which of course totally negates the meaning and definition of complexion. This false definition of complexion has been acceptable by academia for a very long time. However, now that the internet is available to the masses, it allows one to search thousands of keywords in seconds. You should soon come to realize, or at least some people realize, that there is something majorly wrong with how history has been portrayed. Again, as I always do in my videos, I will give you the definition of the word complexion. There are three basic categories when most people are described in history: complexion, hair color, and eye color. Although in modern times we can change our complexion. Take Michael Jackson, for example. He kept his same hair color, however, he has had various complexions. He went from a dark complexion to a pale complexion. He is a perfect example of the extreme differences in complexions. He went from black to white. This is my theory. After conducting years of research, Black Europeans of the colonial era and after did not consider themselves Negroes, or what you and I would consider the typical black person today. There were several reasons for this, and I don't want to delve into it too heavily. I can do that in another video. But briefly, Black Europeans obviously were of a different culture. They spoke European languages, they had distinct accents, the elites considered themselves educated and intellectual. Some also had slight variations in eye color and hair texture, and this was due to hundreds of years of isolation and in many cases mixtures of people. Although, after looking at evidence of Black European sculptures, books, journals, etchings, jewelry, and religious paintings, etc., it's clear that many Black Europeans resemble the typical African American we see walking around today, with all their variations in complexions, eye color, and hair texture. As far as the term Negro and who the Europeans called Negro, they were referring to the Aboriginal people of America, the AKA Indians. Okay, I can hear people now. Oh, sure. Now the American Indians were black people too. This is exactly what I'm saying. There's a huge amount of evidence for this assertion, but I am not going to cover that now. There are researchers who have hours and hours of research backing up this theory. I will do a video on that topic and link all the researchers to that video. Due to the obvious white supremacist tilt on what is provided to the public via our educational system, especially since the Woodrow Wilson administration, pointing out complexion is one of the only ways that the reader can determine the ethnicity of the subject, or in modern terms, is the person black or white. I mentioned Woodrow Wilson because it was during his administration that much of the common historical knowledge was omitted, destroyed, and rewritten to be replaced by Woodrow Wilson's historical point of view. which was based on the Lost Cause narrative. The Lost Cause narratives typically portray the Confederacy as a noble, just, and heroic group. So with Wilson's presidential power and academic influence, and also having been the former president of Princeton University, the majority of the nation stopped using the common history books of that era and started using the historical books literally written by Woodrow Wilson. A 10-volume set of history books that, in my estimation, changed a nation. And just as a side note, the Board of Trustees of Princeton University on June 22, 2020, released a statement that read, "Board of Trustees concludes that Wilson's racist views and policies make him an inappropriate namesake for the School of Public and International Affairs and Residential College." The current president, Christopher Eisgruber, I may have pronounced that wrong, in a statement when explaining why the board made its decision said, "Wilson's racism was significant and consequential even by the standards of his own time. He segregated the federal civil service after it had been racially integrated for decades, thereby taking America backward in its pursuit of justice. He not only acquiesced in, but added to the persistent practice of racism in this country, a practice that continues to do harm today." He went on further to say, and I am paraphrasing, "Princeton is part of an America that has too often disregarded, ignored, or excused racism, allowing the persistence of systems that discriminate against Black people." And yet another leading cause of misinformation regarding European and American history was due to the direct and indirect influence of the Daughters of the Confederacy. A great video to watch regarding the impact they had on American history was created by Vox, VOX, on YouTube, and it's titled "How Southern Socialites Rewrote Civil War History." Okay, so now let me show you more evidence as to why I believe that there were thousands of Black Europeans that immigrated to America from Europe. Okay, so now let me show you more evidence as to why I believe that there were thousands of Black Europeans that immigrated to America from Europe. All right, so I'm going to start off with the great Daniel Webster. And so for many of you, you're wondering, who the heck is Daniel Webster? Well, Daniel Webster was born in Salisbury, New Hampshire, January 18, 1782. His parents were Ebenezer Webster and Abigail Webster. Ebenezer was a tavern owner, farmer, politician, and finally a judge. The Websters were of English and Scottish extraction. In Daniel's early life, he was educated at the Phillips Exeter Academy, and then he went on to Dartmouth College. Daniel was a lawyer and a statesman who represented New Hampshire and Massachusetts in the U.S. Congress. He also served as Secretary of State under Presidents Harrison, Tyler, and Fillmore. He argued over 200 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and was a member of the Federalist Party and the National Republican Party, and then the Whig Party. Okay, so my first piece of evidence is from the 53rd Congress, 3rd Session, Senate document, Proceedings in Congress upon the Acceptance of the Statutes of John Stark and Daniel Webster, presented by the state of New Hampshire in 1895. As you can see on page 84, I quote, "Captain Ebenezer Webster, father of the godlike Daniel, the great Constitution expounder, whose statue stands alongside that of Stark in yonder hall, and whose name is writ with his high on the scroll of fame." How little these men could have thought that this sublime portion awaiting them when Daniel, a young lawyer at Portsmouth, on his way to the courts in Concord, and Stark, living in the retirement of his farm, met at the old hotel in Hooksett, and the hero of Bennington spoke from the sale of himself at one time for 40 pounds, and was ready to believe Daniel was the son of Captain Webster because of the same deep, swarthy color of his face, only blacker. Again, pay attention. Not only is he saying Daniel's father was the same deep, swarthy complexion, he says Daniel's face is even blacker. He doesn't mention his hair or eye color. He specifically mentions his face. Again, let me bring to your attention where this document comes from. It's from the 53rd Congress, 3rd Session Senate document, which is an excellent primary source. Okay, so let's look at my next piece of evidence, and this comes from the website Encyclopedia of World Biography. Under notable biographies, we have Daniel Webster. Okay, so you can see under the childhood section for Daniel Webster, first paragraph, it states, while a child, Daniel earned the nickname Black Dan from his dark skin and black hair and eyes. Again, as I have repeatedly said, complexion means the color of skin on someone's face, which is why they had to further describe his hair and eye color, because complexion is a separate category of description. Okay, so my next piece of evidence was a book titled Life of Daniel Webster, given to Harvard Library in 1938, written by George Ticknor Curtis in 1870. As you can see on page 7, chapter titled Family Complexion, it goes on to read, this grandmother, his father's mother, was Susanna Bachelder, a descendant of the Reverend Stephen Bachelder in the county of Rockingham. She had black hair and black eyes, and was a woman of uncommon strength of character. Her son, Mr. Webster's father, inherited from her the Bachelder complexion. Her other sons had the Webster characteristics. The same division of parental traits took place in Mr. Webster's own generation. He himself has said that, of his 4 brothers, only one was dark like himself. The other 3 ran off into the general characteristics belonging to the name. In fact, however, I have understood that his own brother Ezekiel, who was represented as a model of manly beauty, although his complexion was not so dark as Daniel's, had black hair. Okay, so let's break this down just a little bit. So first, the author acknowledges that Daniel's grandmother, his father's mother, had the Bachelder complexion, which he inherited from his father via his grandmother. The author further writes that even Daniel stated that of his 4 brothers, only one was dark like himself. The other 3 resembled the Webster family characteristics. And it goes on further to say that Daniel's brother Ezekiel had a dark complexion, but not as dark as Daniel's. And I'd like to bring this to your attention again. No one's describing Daniel, his father, or his brother as having a shallow or yellow, light brown or brown complexions. They are consistently saying dark complexions, alluding to the fact that these Bachelders were very dark-skinned people. All right, so let's move on in the same book to page 8, and we're going to be a little more than halfway down the page, and we'll pick up where it states, he has a complexion, as General Stark said of him, which burnt gunpowder will not change, and a heart, as his great son has said of him, which he seemed to have borrowed from a lion. Okay, so you see where General Stark stated that burnt gunpowder could not change his complexion? Burnt gunpowder is extremely black, so Stark's statement meant Daniel's complexion was so dark black that you couldn't tell the difference between his skin and burnt gunpowder. All right, so my next piece of evidence comes from a newspaper clipping from the Salem Gazette, dated February 18th, 1834. And the clipping goes on to say, the Richmond Enquirer says, the course of Mr. Webster is anticipated with great interest. He is at this time one of the most prominent men on the chessboard. But we confess that we look to his movements with fear and suspicion. He is a man of gigantic powers, but they originally received a wrong direction. It is related by the white travelers in Africa that the ebony natives imagined the fair complexion of their visitors to be the effect of disease, and consider white as hideous for the human skin. The judgment of the Richmond Enquirer as to the direction of Mr. Webster's powers resembles that of the Africans about complexion. So basically, the Richmond Enquirer is stating that his complexion resembles that of an African. All right, so moving on to an additional piece of evidence, we can see page 3 of the book Daniel Webster, the Orator, copywritten in 1903 by Albert E. Pillsbury, also located at the Harvard Library. The quote goes on to state, speaking about Daniel, he was a delicate child, with a large head, coal black hair, great black eyes, which none who saw them ever forgot, and a complexion so swarthy that they called him Little Black Dan. All right, so again, Daniel's complexion is referred to as black, which is where his nickname came from. It didn't come from his hair color or eye color, because that would make no sense. Okay, so let me ask you, how many of you know a white person with pale, fair, or fresh skin complexions that also have black hair and dark eyes and have a nickname with the adjective black in it? That wouldn't make any sense. Like Daniel, people with nicknames that have black in them probably 99% of the time means or meant that that person had dark skin or complexion. Okay, so my next piece of evidence comes from the book The True Daniel Webster, written by Sidney George Fisher, published in 1911. All right, so on page 21, you can see it states, on his father's side, he was descended from the Backelders or the Batchilders, a dark complexioned, dark-haired family from whom the poet Whittier was supposed to be descended. Okay, so moving down to the bottom of the page there, last paragraph, it says, his two descendants, Webster and Whittier, who are said to have resembled him and somewhat each other in striking appearance, would seem to indicate a prepotency to genius in the strain. Poetic and romantic sentiment filled the lives of both of them and was the foundation of Webster's oratory. Webster had the dark eyes, hair, and complexion of the Backelders. Okay, we're moving on to page 22 now. Okay, and continue the quote, in excessive degree. Okay, so I keep giving you evidence of Daniel and his family's complexion. Now the author mentions Whittier, as in a famous poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, as being descended from the same dark complexion family. Uh-oh, spoiler alert. How far down the rabbit hole are we willing to uncover the truth? I say all the way. Okay, so we'll get to the poet John Whittier a little bit later in the video. All right, so still looking at Daniel Webster, on page 51 of the same book, it states, Ezekiel too joined the New England aristocracy of education. He was of dark hair and complexion like the father and Daniel, very handsome, and famous all his life in New Hampshire for his good looks. His ability was of the solid, conservative order, equal, as some supposed, to Daniel's, and he became a prominent citizen of New Hampshire, an important man in politics, a member for many years of one or the other branch of the legislature, and a much sought legal advisor. But he had, it seems, none of the brilliance or quickness of apprehension of his distinguished brother, and died suddenly while speaking in the courtroom at Concord at the age of 49. So, according to this, dark complexion Ezekiel was also of the New England aristocracy education. Funny thing, I grew up and was educated in New England, and not a peep about the famous Webster family being black. Okay, so moving on to page 69 of the same book, I'm going to start off with a quote that states, his brothers and sisters had none of his marvelous power. He stood alone among them. In the animal kingdom, naturalists used to give to such sudden development in a species the name sport, and in modern times, the Darwinians call it a mutation. It is impossible to account for such appearances, as it is impossible to account for Mr. Webster's contemporary genius, Napoleon, the most extraordinary mutation in human intellect and physical endurance that has ever been known. Perhaps the cross of the blonde, slender Webster type of outdoor farming people with a dark complexion, heavy built, indoors, intellectual, learned Bachelder strain was a lucky outcross, what the animal breeders call a nick. Such a combination of opposites will sometimes give us a hunting dog or a horse, unmatched for courage, breadth, and speed, as Sir Walter Scott would say. But even in this profound explanation is merely another way of saying, I don't know. So basically, as I interpret this, I believe the author was baffled by how the dark-complexioned Daniel could have stood out virtually alone amongst all of his family with his genius and skill, not to be duplicated by any of them, even though many of them had the white Webster family complexions. I definitely feel a hint of racism coming from the author. Remember, he was writing this book in the early 1900s, more than 50 years after Daniel's death, and white supremacy was really ramping up, making the way for the Woodrow Wilson era. So before I end this video, I want to show you images of Daniel Webster that I found online. Now, as you can see, these are 3 typical images of Daniel that you find when conducting research online. Does anything immediately jump out at you? Yeah, well, the most glaring thing is that Daniel was not shown as being dark complexioned, let alone swarthy or black. Remember, his childhood nickname was Little Black Dan, and according to his descriptions, he's supposed to have really dark skin. This is obviously not the case based on the images that I was able to find of him. As I mentioned before, whoever owns the media, that's like newspapers, libraries, historical societies, photos, paintings, etc., or can provide access to them, controls what the public sees. Therefore, we get images that don't match the description of these people that I'm showing you. Please keep that in mind while you're watching my videos. Look, I just have to truly confess that I'm fascinated by this research. I hope this video has been interesting so far, or at least informative. Okay, so I was going to include the dark complexioned Colonel Ebenezer Webster, Daniel's father, as one of my prominent Americans. However, we have covered him and his family quite extensively already. I do want to conclude this segment regarding Daniel and his family by reminding you that the Bach elders are of English and Scottish extraction or genealogy, furthering my point that many of the Europeans that came to America were black people. However, as I mentioned earlier in the video, these black Europeans didn't consider themselves Negroes or aka black people. They were considered white. Crazy, I know, but I will show you direct documented evidence of this assertion in my next video. All right, so let's move on to another prominent American that we all were taught was a white person. And that would be Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, I realize that we were all taught that Thurgood Marshall was the first black Supreme Court justice. Well, we were all fooled again. And when I say all, I mean most of us. Of course, this information is available, but you have to know what keywords to pay attention to, which is why I always focus in on the word complexion, because that is one of the only indicators that you will get when researching a lot of this material. So who was Chief Justice John Marshall? This is what Google and many books say he looks like. However, as I am revealing to you, that is not what is written. Okay, so let me tell you about who John Marshall was. And I'm getting this description from Wikipedia. John Marshall was born September 24th, 1755, and he died on July 6, 1835. He was an American politician and lawyer who served as the 4th Chief Justice of the United States from 1801 to 1835. Marshall remains the longest serving Chief Justice and the 4th longest serving Chief Justice in Supreme Court history. And he is widely regarded as one of the most influential justices to ever sit on the Supreme Court. Prior to joining the Supreme Court, Marshall served as the United States Secretary of State under President John Adams. Marshall was born in Fauquier County, Virginia in 1755. After the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, he joined the Continental Army, serving in numerous battles. During the later stages of the war, he was admitted to the state bar and won election to the Virginia House of Delegates. Marshall favored the ratification of the United States Constitution, and he played a major role in Virginia's ratification of that document. At the request of President Adams, Marshall traveled to France in 1795 to help bring an end to the attacks on American shipping. In what became known as the XYZ affair, the government of France refused to open negotiations unless the United States agreed to pay bribes. After returning to the United States, Marshall won election to the United States House of Representatives and emerged as a leader in the Federalist Party in Congress. He was appointed to Secretary of State in 1800 after a cabinet shakeup, becoming an important figure in the Adams administration. Okay, so we all know John Marshall's role in American history now. Here are 3 different images of him from Google. Okay, so let's get to some of the evidence that I have to show you that John Marshall was a black man. So my first piece of evidence is from the book by U.S. Circuit Court Judge Horace H. Lorton in 1901. By the way, this book was gifted to Harvard Library in 1906. As you can see on page 23 of this book, I quote from William Wirt. By the way, Mr. Wirt was the Attorney General for the United States under President James Monroe. The quote goes on to say, "The Chief Justice of the United States is in his person, tall, meager, emaciated, his muscles so relaxed as not only to disqualify apparently for any vigorous exertion of the body, but to destroy everything like harmony in his air and movements. Indeed, in his whole appearance and demeanor, dress, attitudes, gesture, sitting, standing, or walking, he is as far removed from the idolized graces of Lord Chesterfield as any other gentleman on earth. His head and face are small in comparison with his height, his complexion swarthy. The muscles of his face being relaxed make him appear to be 50 years of age, nor can he be much younger. His countenance has a faithful expression of great good humor and hilarity, while his black eyes that unerringly index possess an irradiating spirit, which proclaims the imperial powers of the mind that sits enthroned within." Okay, so let me reiterate what I just read. John Marshall had a swarthy complexion, okay? Not a light brown, not a dark brown, swarthy. And the word swarthy means black, okay? Just wanted to reemphasize that. The quote also mentions that he had black eyes. Also worth mentioning again was the fact that this quote was written in a book from a U.S. Circuit Court judge that knew Justice Marshall. And the actual person saying the quote was Mr. Wirt, who was the U.S. Attorney General under President Monroe. Both extremely credible people with firsthand knowledge. Okay, so moving on to my next piece of evidence, and this is from a book entitled An Eulogy of the Life and Character of John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States by Horace Binney, 1835, also located in the Harvard Library. All right, on page 22, you can see there down at the bottom, I quote, "He was about 6 feet high, straight and rather slender, of a dark complexion," and we're moving on to page 23 there at the top. And it continues on to say, "showing little, if any, rosy red, yet good health. The outline of the face nearly a circle, and within that eyes dark to blackness, strong and penetrating, beaming with intelligence and good nature. An upright forehead rather low, was terminated in the horizontal line by a mass of raven black hair of unusual thickness and strength. The features of the face were in harmony with this outline, and the temples fully developed. The result of this combination was interesting and very agreeable. The body and limbs indicated agility rather than strength, in which, however, he was by no means deficient. He wore a purple or pale blue hunting shirt and trousers of the same material fringed with white. A round black hat, mounted with buck's tail for a cockade, crowned the figure and the man." Okay, so what I just read was Justice Marshall had a dark complexion, eyes dark to blackness, and a mass of raven black hair of unusual thickness. That sure doesn't come across in the images given to us in modern times, does it? All right, so the next piece of evidence is by his biographer from the Charlotte Observer newspaper, dated October 3rd, 1909. As you can see, it states, "When a youth of 19, Marshall joined the Continental Army. Here is how he looked according to his biographer. He was about 6 feet, straight and slender, of a dark complexion, with eyes as blackness, strong and penetrating, beaming with intelligence and good nature. An upright forehead, rather low, was terminated in a horizontal line by a mass of raven black hair of unusual thickness and strength." Again, you can see his biographer is saying that he had a dark complexion, eyes as dark as blackness, and raven black hair. All right, so here is another newspaper clipping from the Rhode Island American, dated February 24th, 1834. All right, you can see the newspaper clipping which states, "Along the tribunal, covered with green cloth, you see Chief Justice Marshall take his seat in the center. You think of him as the author of the voluminous, authentic, and valuable, but not elaborate, the polished life of Washington sooner than as Chief Justice of the United States. He is now apparently at the age of about 60, without any marks of infirmity in his person. He is a large, thick-set, and athletic man, with a grave, substantial countenance of a dark complexion, and with no prominent features. His hair is of an iron gray, cut short before, and tied in a club behind. I have hardly heard him speak, except in interlocutory business, and probably in an undertone of voice. In his movements, he appears to manifest much of the Virginia stateliness and dignity of manners. His external appearance indicates him to be what he is in fact, a solid and substantial man, without any extraordinary share of genius, taste, or elegance." Okay, so as you can see, Justice Marshall is referred to as having a dark complexion. His hair is iron gray. He is a reverenced and highly respected Virginian. So what happened to turn the tide against people with dark skin in this country? Well, I will get to that in a future video. For now, I just want you to ponder this video and other videos that I've made available or provided links to. All right, so this next newspaper clipping is from a different newspaper. This one is from the Vermont Sentinel, published as the Northern Sentinel, dated March 12, 1834. And this newspaper apparently carried the same news report. Okay, so there are definitely more sources that I can provide. Unfortunately, if I did that, I wouldn't be able to get to the other prominent Black Americans that I have rediscovered. And before I move on, I just want to bring your attention again that none of these sources that I'm quoting are saying, hey, this is highly unusual to have a man of a dark complexion, a black man in charge of these very important American institutions. I just don't want you to lose sight of that as I'm going over all of these important, prominent individuals. All right, so in this section, I'm going to detour for a few minutes to discuss a very relevant topic to my research. And that topic is, what does it mean to be white in America before 1900? All right, so as you can see on the screen, I'm going to be referencing a newspaper article from the State newspaper dated March 1914. This paper was located in Columbia, South Carolina. The paper was covering the contest in the 1895 South Carolina State Constitutional Convention regarding the topic of the standard of white person and prohibition of interbreeding with Negroes. Again, you can see the article on the screen I'm referring to, and right off the bat, you can see the main title states, "For needed reforms in South Carolina," which in my mind means some South Carolinians have been dealing with something for a while that they feel needs to be changed. They are discussing how to amend the South Carolina State Constitution. I'm going to read the first few paragraphs, which kind of sets the tone for the article. As you can see there in the first paragraph, it starts, "It is instructive to review the contest in the Constitutional Convention of 1895 over the standard of white person and the prohibition of interbreeding with Negroes. Some of us have forgotten and some have never known that this was recognized as a problem and was a subject of grave consideration and debate 18 years ago. To many, the whole question seems new and the facts when presented are surprising. Unfortunately, men take little forethought for the morrow. Thus, evil tendencies make great headway before the body of the people can be aroused to perceive them and combat them. Only acute ills move the masses. The prophet who would have saved his people can never get a hearing until actual suffering comes to prove the truth of his warnings. Nevertheless, statesmanship requires a studious search for the basic truths in present conditions and the calculation of their consequences even to the far future, and likewise requires patient, intelligent effort to discover the remedies to remove the causes of evil now and to come. Without vision, the people must perish. Future good is at the price of present self-denial. The highest duty demands of the highest intelligence every personal sacrifice to safeguard mankind now, in beginning, and to be born. Okay, so basically the speaker is bringing attention back to the issue of who white people are and how important it is to keep Negroes from procreating and from having white privilege. The author goes on to say and alludes to the issue that few men think about how these issues will affect white people, not only presently, but in the future. This is evident when he says, and likewise requires patient, intelligent effort to discover the remedies to remove the causes of evil now and to come. He is also saying, and I'm paraphrasing, be careful, white people. Take action now so we can safeguard mankind now in being and to be born, aka future generations. All right, so next they move on to the topic of miscegenation. Miscegenation means the interbreeding of people to be of different racial types. Keep in mind, race has been determined to be a social construct since the 1950s. However, we are currently talking about 1895. All right, so I want to move on to that next quote under miscegenation. And it goes on to say, E.F. Taylor of Chesterfield proposed the following as a section of the new Constitution. The intermarriage of white persons with Negroes, mulattoes, or persons of mixed blood descended from a Negro is prohibited in this state. This legislature shall enforce this section by appropriate legislation. And then it goes on to O.R. Lohman of Orangeburg offering the same provision with the additional words before the verb, or they're living together as man and wife. And then they're under section, looks like 34 or 84, it looks like a 34, I think. The marriage of a white person with a Negro, mulatto, or person who shall have 1/8 or more of Negro blood shall be unlawful and void. So here the committee rejected the aforementioned proposals and brought forward a proposal that used a 1/8 or more Negro blood rule. All right, then the article further goes on to say, this report being under consideration, George Johnstone of Newbury moved to amend by striking out 1/8 or more of and inserting the any, which was agreed to. All right, so just recapping that session, George Johnstone proposed striking out 1/8 and adding any Negro blood. All right, so just below that, we can see it says disqualify miscegenator. And here, Robert Smalls of Beaufort, a ginger cake Negro, the author is describing the color of this legislator's complexion. So again, realize that there are some black legislators in this convention discussing these life-changing issues, and they have prior to this convention been considered white men. All right, so Smalls goes on to say, and I quote, and that any white person who lives and cohabitates with a Negro or mulatto or person who shall have 1/8 or more of Negro blood shall be disqualified from holding any office of emolument or trust in this state. And the offspring of such living or cohabitating shall bear the name of the father and shall be entitled to inherit and acquire property the same as if they were legitimate. Okay, so I want to point out here that, in my opinion, Smalls is assuming that he will continue to have the status of white that he previously had. However, he does mention that any offspring of this illegal union shall bear the name of the father and be entitled to inherit and acquire property the same as if they were legitimate. That, in my opinion, shows that he wants a loophole, knowing that his children or his family members or others in this sort of situation, should that section be added and made into law, he and other black men that were considered white would still be able to retain some wealth. All right, so further down the page, it goes on to say, M.R. Cooper then renewed his amendment after debate with Robert Smalls, B.R. Tillman, George E. Prince of Anderson, R.D. Lee, and Thos E. Miller of Beaufort, canary-colored, a motion to lay the Cooper Amendment on the table was defeated, and pending further debate, the convention adjourned, Smalls having the floor. You can see another legislator, Thos E. Miller of Beaufort, referred to as canary-colored. I'm going to assume his complexion is of a lighter complexion, aka black person. Keep in mind, all these legislators, whether they are darker or lighter complexioned, were wealthy men. Okay, so now I'm going to be moving on to the section called White Standard. The first speaker is D.S. Henderson of Aiken, and he moved to add the following: nothing in this section contained shall be construed to invalidate any such marriage heretofore legally entered into, or affect the offspring of thereof, or the future marriage of any such offspring with white persons. He is basically saying if you were labeled as white before and are presently legally married to a fair or dark complexioned person, you and your offspring are exempt from any of the future laws that will be enacted in regards to who is considered a white person. The article goes on further to say that eventually the B.R. Tillman Amendment was adopted and the section as amended was adopted. That meant that the word any, as in any Negro blood. Okay, so moving on to the last section called White Status. It goes on to read, the convention having adjourned October 4th to October 15th, the article of the Constitution on the legislative department was again under consideration on the 16th of October, and W.D. Evans moved to reconsider Section 34, which was agreed to. He then moved and added the following: provided that this section shall not be so construed as to disqualify for marriage with white persons any person or his or her issue who shall have had at or before the adoption of the Constitution the status of white persons. Okay, so again we see another legislator say, and I'm paraphrasing, that this section of the law should not disqualify for marriage with white persons any person or his or her issue who shall have at or before the adoption of the Constitution the status of white persons. In my opinion, he is clearly trying to protect the white status of those dark-complexioned, wealthy European families that have had the status of being considered white the entire time since 1619. Then we can see that T.B. Frazier Sr. of Sumter offers a substitute for the Evans Amendment, which says, provided that the status of no person who has heretofore been recognized as legally white shall be in any way affected by the provisions of this section. All right, so Frazier's Amendment is still advocating for the preservation of white status for dark-complexioned people of wealth. All right, so let's move down to the heading that says, pure white loses. And from there, we'll go down to the paragraph that starts, Robert Smalls then renewed his amendment, omitting this time the clause which provided that the colored illegitimates should share in the inheritance of property. And he goes on further to say, and any white person who lives and cohabitates with a Negro, mulatto, or person who shall have 1/8 or more of Negro blood shall be disqualified from holding any office of emolument or trust in the state, and the offspring of any such living or cohabitating shall bear the name of the father. Well, his amendment failed. And I'm just going to read this last part that says, the suffrage article of this Constitution includes miscegenation as one of the crimes upon conviction of which a person shall be disqualified from voting and therefore from holding office. But there are practically no persecutions. This crime is defined by the legislature as attempted intermarriage between a white person and any mulatto, half-breed, Indian, Negro, or mestizo. So these wealthy, mostly fair-complexioned men were determined to disenfranchise anyone who wanted to marry, cohabitate, or procreate with anyone they now considered non-white. And this time they meant non-fair-complexioned people, aka all people with dark complexions, or those persons that maybe had lighter skin in conjunction with typical maybe black facial features or hair texture. Anyway, this really shows the power of politics and how it can be corrupted. Fair complexioned politicians had the majority and easily took away people with dark complexions and their descendants' wealth, suffrage, and humanity because they were greedy, jealous, envious, and power hungry, not wanting to compete for resources man to man, as had been the case for 200 plus years, regardless of complexion, but rather remove any way for a person of color to advance themselves and their families. What you can clearly see is that miscegenation had been going on before 1895. That means there are plenty of AKA white people descended from black great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers who have no idea about their lineage because before the late 1800s, being white was a status, not a skin color. You can also clearly see that the status of being white was bestowed on people of darker complexions as well as people with very light complexions, aka white people. As I mentioned previously, a dark complexioned person from Europe was considered white, even if they were as dark in complexion as Daniel Webster, aka Black Dan. Okay, so maybe it's just my perception, but you should clearly be able to see through this article that being considered white was a status and had nothing to do with skin color. I will also show you in a future video how this white status continued to be bestowed on just about anyone who immigrated to the United States well into the present times, as long as they didn't come from a perceived black country. All right, so moving on to my next prominent American. And you may be familiar with this gentleman, John Greenleaf Whittier. That's right, I said John Greenleaf Whittier. Now, some may not be familiar with this gentleman, so let me tell you a little bit about him. The reason I chose him is because he was a poet that I read about in grade school, and no one alluded to the obvious fact that he was a black man. I guess my English teachers just glanced over the fact that he had a dark, swarthy complexion. It's sort of like reading about a town that has a purple polar bear, but all the pictures you're shown contain a white one. But then no one questions the major discrepancy. Anyway, I digress. All right, so John Greenleaf Whittier. He was born December 17th, 1807, died September 7th, 1892. He was an American Quaker poet and advocate of the abolition of slavery in the United States. Frequently listed as one of the fireside poets, he was influenced by the Scottish poet Robert Burns. Whittier is remembered particularly for his anti-slavery writings, as well as his book Snowbound. All right, so Mr. Whittier was born to John and Abigail at their rural homestead in Haverhill, Massachusetts, on December 17th, 1807. His middle name was thought to mean Feuillevert after his Huguenot forebears. He grew up on a farm in a household with his parents, a brother and two sisters, a maternal aunt, and a paternal uncle. From 1838 to 1840, he was the editor of the Pennsylvania Freeman in Philadelphia, one of the leading anti-slavery papers in the North, formerly known as the National Enquirer. In May 1838, the publication moved its offices to the newly opened Pennsylvania Hall on North 6th Street, which was shortly after burned by a pro-slavery mob. Whittier also continued to write poetry, and nearly all of his poems then dealt with the problem of slavery. Whittier's first two published books were Legends of New England, 1831, and the poem Molly Pitcher, 1832. In 1833, he published The Song of the Vermonters, 1779, which he had anonymously inserted into the New England magazine. All right, so I got that information from wikipedia.com. All right, so first, if you recall, I mentioned reading about Whittier when going over Daniel Webster in the book by Sidney George Fisher, Life of Daniel Webster, page 2. The author states that Webster and Whittier were both descended from the Bachelder family. He also wrote that they were said to have resembled each other in appearance. It's quite obvious to me that he is referring to their similar complexions, which would make sense if the Bachelders were known for their dark complexions. All right, so my first piece of evidence for Mr. Whittier here is from Frederica Bremer. And Frederica Bremer was born August 1801, died December 31st, 1865. And she was a Swedish writer and feminist reformer. Her sketches of everyday life were wildly popular in Britain and the United States during the 1840s and 1850s. and she is regarded as the Swedish Jane Austen, bringing the realist novel to prominence in Swedish literature. So, in her sketches of American homes, she gives an outline portrait of Whittier as he appeared when 40 years of age. And she goes on to say, I quote, "He has a good exterior, a figure slender and tall, a beautiful head with refined features, black eyes full of fire, dark complexion, a fine smile, and lively but very nervous manner. Both soul and spirit have overstrained the nervous cords and wasted the body. He belongs to those natures who would advance the firmness and joy to martyrdom in a good cause, and yet who are never comfortable in society, and who looks as if they would run out the door every moment. He lives with his mother and sister in a country house to which I have promised to go. I feel that I should enjoy myself with Whittier, and could make him feel at ease with me. I know from my own experience what this nervous bashfulness caused by the overexertion of the brain requires, and how persons who suffer therefrom ought to be met and treated." Okay, so she tells us a lot about Whittier, but what I'm going to emphasize is her description of him having a dark complexion. All right, so let's move on to our next piece of evidence, and that is from the Dictionary of American Biography. And this description was published under the auspices of the American Council of Learned Societies, archive.org. All right, so it goes on to say, Whittier was a tall man with piercing dark eyes and a swarthy complexion, and was somewhat vain with respect to his appearance. Although a genial person, he would occasionally flash out in anger when people did not agree with him. He resented the reputation he had of being a saint. That he was of a heroic spirit is beyond question, for he sacrificed much, endured abuse, and faced physical perils in his devotion to the cause which he espoused. And it continues to say, he had a fine sense of humor and was adept at telling amusing tales. Toward other people's beliefs, he was in general tolerant, and he sympathized keenly with those who were persecuted on account of their race, color, and creed. I wonder why. Was it maybe that he had the status of being considered a white man because of his European heritage, even though he was a black man in his outward appearance? So just to sum up some of this information I just read, Whittier is described by Bremer as having a dark complexion and by the American Council of Learned Societies as having a swarthy complexion. And as you can see, I have two photos and one drawing of Whittier. The two photos are obviously not showing a dark complexion or a swarthy man. The drawing, on the other hand, may be a little closer to what he may have looked like, especially noticing his woolly, curly hair texture versus the other two that have straight hair. Although even in the drawing, he is not shown with a dark complexion. All right, so that's what I found on John Greenleaf Whittier. All right, so let's move on to a big one, Abraham Lincoln. Yes, I said Abraham Lincoln. I don't think I have to introduce this man because if you were educated in the United States, you were taught just about everything about him, except for the fact that he had a self-prescribed dark complexion. Now, isn't it funny that his complexion never gets any attention? Okay, so I'm going to give you the bare minimum on Mr. Lincoln, and then I'll move on to the evidence I have for him. All right, so Abraham Lincoln was born February 12, 1809, and he died April 15, 1865. He was an American statesman and lawyer who served as the 16th President of the United States from 1861 to 1865. Lincoln led the nation through its greatest moral, constitutional, and political crisis, the American Civil War. He succeeded in preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, bolstering the federal government, and modernizing the U.S. economy. Lincoln was born into poverty in a log cabin and was raised on the frontier primarily in Indiana. He was self-educated and became a lawyer, Whig Party leader, Illinois state legislator, and U.S. congressman for Illinois. In 1849, he returned to his law practice, but became very vexed by the opening of additional lands to slavery as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He re-entered politics in 1854, becoming a leader in the new Republican Party, and he reached a national audience in the 1858 debates against Stephen Douglas. Lincoln ran for president in 1860, sweeping the North in victory. Pro-slavery elements in the South equated his success with the North's rejection of their right to practice slavery, and the Southern states began seceding from the Union. To secure its independence, the new Confederate states fired on Fort Sumter, a U.S. fort in the South, and Lincoln called upon forces to suppress the rebellion and restore the Union. All right, so that whole description was from Wikipedia.com. All right, so that was just a little bit about our 16th President of the United States. Let's look at some of the evidence that shows he was a black man. All right, so from the U.S. National Park Service website, we can read that Lincoln wrote 3 autobiographies. In his second autobiography, dated December 20th, 1859, he described himself saying, quote, "If any personal description of me is thought desirable, it may be said, I am in height 6 feet 4 inches, nearly, lean in flesh, weighing on average 180 pounds, dark complexion with coarse black hair and gray eyes. No other marks or brands recollected." All right, so the giveaways in his own description are dark complexion and coarse black hair. Now remember, as I explained and showed you via the 1895 South Carolina Convention discussions, Abraham Lincoln, having the appearance of a black man, was considered white because he could trace his lineage back to Europe. Now again, this is my theory, but that is why I'm explaining to you how I came to this conclusion. Okay, so my next source is from the U.S. Congressional Record, dated February 12th, 1927, located on pages 3610 and 3611. These pages contain the same Lincoln autobiographical quote from Lincoln's own book, as you can see on the screen, where he states that he has a dark complexion. I'm showing you this reference because I want you to realize that everyone in Congress knew that he had a dark complexion, and no one disputed it. In fact, I'm going to go further. There were quite a few congressional members that had dark complexions. However, as I mentioned, the term white man or male was a status. So someone referring to this statesman today as a white man and not knowing this information that I shared with you today would jump to the wrong conclusion. Okay, so on to my next piece of evidence, and this is from history.net, and it's titled Lincoln the Homely, written by Harold Holzer. Holzer has a quote on page 7 that states, Nathaniel Hawthorne firsthand in 1862, quote, "His hair was black, still unmixed with gray, stiff, somewhat bushy, and had apparently been acquainted with neither brush nor comb. His complexion is dark and shallow, betokening, I fear, an insalubrious atmosphere around the White House. He has thick black eyebrows and an impending brow. His nose is large, and the lines about his mouth are strongly defined." Just as a side note, I'm sure you're wondering what insalubrious means, and I did, so I looked it up, and according to Google's dictionary online, it means like unpleasant or unsavory. So I guess they're saying that the atmosphere around the White House at that time was unpleasant. Okay, so going back to the description I just read from Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was actually an eyewitness, stating that Lincoln had a dark and shallow complexion. And shallow, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, means having a yellowish color, of a pale, sickly color, tinged with a dark yellow, as in a shallow skin. Hawthorne also mentions that Lincoln's hair is stiff and somewhat bushy, along with a large nose. All right, so then Holzer also writes that journalists vented endlessly about whether he was, in fact, too ugly to serve as president, castigating him as a lank-sided Yankee of the unloveliest and of the dirtiest complexion. The Charleston Mercury assailed him as a horrid-looking wretch, sooty and scoundrelly in aspect, a cross between the nutmeg dealer, the horse swapper, and the nightman, a creature fit evidently for petty treasons, small stratagems, and all sorts of spoils. Holzer further writes, "It is fair to say that no one has ever before or since looked quite like Abraham Lincoln. Certainly not his own children, who resemble their mother's family, not their father's. We have no pictures of Lincoln's own mother, who is said to be large-boned, tough-skinned like her son, but who died long before photography became commonplace. The future president's father supposedly sat for a lone photograph late in his life, but historians remain uncertain that it really shows Thomas Lincoln. It was as if the face sprang uniquely from the Kentucky soil, from the Indiana prairie, and from what Nathaniel Hawthorne called the village experience. You know, in my opinion, it's interesting that there are no paintings or etchings of the president's own mother. Or are they just not being shown to us? If Abraham Lincoln resembled his mother, then I'm assuming she also had a dark complexion and maybe some typical black facial features. Also, I'm not sure what Hawthorne meant by the village experience. All right, so another piece of evidence comes from a book called A Self-Made Man: The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1849, by Sidney Blumenthal. In the book, the author reveals that Lincoln admitted that he had been an indentured servant, a slave, rented out by his father to neighbors in rural Indiana. The author has a quote from Herndon that states, "If he was angry with his father, he also knew that his father had been reduced to a dirt farmer and compelled to flee Kentucky to escape from slavery. Slave states are places for poor white people to remove from, not to remove to," Lincoln said in 1854 in his opposition to Douglas's Nebraska Act. I want you to again remember that just because he considered himself a white man, that is not what his description revealed. This book also mentions Lincoln's self-prescribed description of himself, although this author points out that at the end of Lincoln's description, he uses the words, "no other marks or brands recollected." This is the same terminology used by slave masters that had newspaper ads looking for their slaves. In my opinion, Lincoln was acknowledging his former status as a fugitive and his understanding of the evils of slavery. All right, so my next piece of evidence regarding President Lincoln is from the book Life of Lincoln, written by Clifton M. Nichols, published in 1896, and we're going to page 12 and 13. As you can see at the bottom of page 12, the author is writing about Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father. It goes on to read, "A most remarkable and almost inexplicable fact is that to Thomas Lincoln was reserved the honor of an illustrious paternity. Thomas was about 5 feet 10 inches in height, weighed about 200 pounds, had dark brown eyes, dark skin, and black hair." Okay, so no ambiguous terms there. The author directly writes that Thomas Lincoln had dark skin. Obviously, this makes sense because Abe had dark skin, and naturally, you obtain your complexion from one or both of your parents. Okay, so my last piece of evidence for President Lincoln is from the book called The Lincoln Encyclopedia, The Spoken and Written Words of Abraham Lincoln. All right, I'm going to reiterate, these are Abraham Lincoln's own words, and they were compiled and edited by Archer H. Shaw, with introduction by David C. Mearns, Assistant Librarian, Library of Congress, 1950. And we're going to go to page 190, and it says, "Lincoln, Abraham, personal description of." And the quote says, "Perhaps you have forgotten me. Don't you remember a long black fellow who rode on horseback with you from Tremont to Springfield nearly 10 years ago, swimming our horses over the Mackinac on the trip? Well, I am the same old fellow yet. To Joseph Hewitt, February 13th, 1848. All right, so you can see in his own quote, he calls himself a long black fellow who rode on horseback. Okay, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, okay? A long black fellow? Hello, that's screaming black guy, at least where I'm from. I'm going to give you a for instance here. Pretend someone just flags down the police and says, "Hey, someone just stole something from me." And the police say, "Well, what did he look like?" "Well, he looked like a long black fellow. He was riding on horseback." Guess what, folks? They're not going to be looking for a white guy. All right, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to share all the prime sources of evidence I have for Abraham Lincoln because I wouldn't be able to get to anyone else. However, I do want to give you a link to an outstanding researcher named Karamiu Awa. He has an extremely informative YouTube channel. I love his research because he backs everything up with sources, so you can check them out for yourself. Anyway, he did a great video on Abraham Lincoln called "The Truth About Abraham Lincoln, Runaway Indentured Servant, Colored Man." I highly recommend it. I will leave a link to it in the information section of this video. Alright, so this brings me to another point. As I continue to show you this research regarding these prominent dark-complexioned Americans, sometimes it's easy to forget that they come from dark-complexioned parents, and thus dark-complexioned extended families. I showed you that when I was explaining Daniel Webster's mother's family, the Batchelders. I bring this up because sometimes we can lose sight of the entirety of what I am revealing to you. In other words, there were thousands of these black Europeans immigrating to America for hundreds of years. What changed were the laws and the power brokers in America. What also changed was how we were educated, no longer teaching the truth, but a white supremacist-based history and agenda. This, in my opinion, started in the latter half of the 1800s, several years after the Civil War, and went into high gear when Woodrow Wilson became president. He, along with all the lost cause revisionists across the country. We can see how this came to fruition just by looking at the United States' current Trump administration. Currently, we have some congressmen, senators, and administration staffers who will do the president's bidding regardless of the moral and ethical implications. They will purport his lies with no guilt whatsoever. Trump has used his executive power to reverse and institute hundreds of policies. This is what I believe happened during the Wilson administration, except he had 2 terms to accomplish his agenda. 2 of the most glaring policy changes occurred when Wilson resegregated the entire federal government and also ordered the firing of many black employees nationwide. The second glaring policy change was the introduction into the American educational system of his version of history contained in a 7-volume series that was eventually instituted nationwide in some form or fashion. What this also says to me is that Wilson had control of the National Archives, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the National Park Service, etc. This means he controlled a vast majority of our historical documents, books, paintings, photos, scientific finds, etc. I hope you are beginning to see where I'm going with this. This is why I believe the paintings, photos, etc. don't match the written words. Anyway, I will try to tackle these areas in future videos. Alright, so from here forward, I'm going to speed up because I know this is turning into a very long video. The issue is there's just so much to show, or should I say reveal. Alright, so here's a quote from a famous American poet, Walt Whitman. And this is sourced from a book called Walt Whitman, A Biography by Milton Meltzer, published in 1915. All right, so we're going to go on to page 92, and it goes on to say, on his way to Washington to be inaugurated, Lincoln stopped in New York to stay overnight at the Astor House, opposite City Hall Park. He stepped out of the horse-drawn carriage to stretch his arms and legs. As he looked out over the huge crowd of 30,000 to 40,000 people, there was an unbroken silence. Walt said he had a great view of Mr. Lincoln. His perfect composure and coolness, his unusual and uncouth height, his dress of complete black, stovepipe hat pushed back on the head, dark brown complexion, seamed and wrinkled yet uncanny-looking face, black, bushy head of hair, disproportionately long neck, and his hands held behind him as he stood observing the people. He looked with curiosity upon the immense sea of faces, and the sea of faces returned the look with similar curiosity. All right, so that same quote from Walt Whitman appears in another book by Leon Bezleget, and I probably pronounced that wrong. Anyway, the book is called Walt Whitman, The Man and His Work, and we're going to page 197 of that book. As you can see, Walt Whitman describes Lincoln as having a dark brown complexion with a black curly head of hair. Okay, wait a minute. Lincoln's dark complexion is obviously common knowledge at this time in history. And generally we hear that his hair is black, but rarely do we hear about the texture of his hair being curly. Do you see the discrepancy here? Take a look at the pictures I have here of Lincoln. What hair texture does he obviously have in these photos? It's definitely not bushy. It's definitely not curly. However, it is black, but that's the only thing. So Walt Whitman being a poet, in my mind, would mean that he would be very observant and descriptive in order to write and express himself, right? I don't think he's someone that would misperceive the president's hair texture or his complexion for that matter. In his quote about Lincoln, it says, he studied and noted Lincoln, describing him in great detail. All right, so next I have Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, and he missed being president by 5 weeks. Most history students know that Abraham Lincoln's vice president was Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. But few know that Johnson was vice president for only 5 weeks. The vice president during the 4 years of Lincoln's first term was Hannibal Hamlin. One of the first members of the Republican Party, Hamlin was dropped from the ticket in 1864 in favor of Johnson, who would bring more votes to the difficult re-election campaign. All right, so Hannibal Hamlin was born in Paris Hill, Maine, on August 27, 1809. His father, Cyrus Hamlin, was a physician who had graduated from Harvard. Hannibal grew up in prosperous surroundings and had a good education. Always active physically, he was athletic as well as being an avid reader. After local public schools, he attended Hebron Academy. That information I just gave you was from the worldhistory.us website. So here's another excerpt from that same website, and it goes on to read, the campaign was not all parades and parties. While Southerners proclaimed Lincoln and Hamlin to be radical abolitionists, Robert Barnwell Rhett, editor of the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury, wrote that Hamlin is what we call a mulatto. He has black blood in him. Hamlin did have a dark complexion, but no one outside of the South took the charge seriously. All right, so let's look at that last statement they made there saying, but no one outside the South took the charge seriously. In my mind, a dark complexion means he could possibly be black. I don't know, call me crazy. Of course, this is all they mention about him being a black man on his website. This is so typical when you don't want to go into depth on a subject because it doesn't fit the accepted national narrative. How do you glance over a black vice president to Lincoln? Let me ask you, did your teachers mention Vice President Hamlin and the fact that he was black or had a dark complexion? My guess would be that they did not. All right, so let's move on to another source, and this is from a book called Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, Lincoln's First Vice President by Draper Hunt, published 1969. And it goes on to say, Hamlin, sire of 17 children by 2 doubtlessly weary wives, lived in Barnstable, Massachusetts. Geographically, an ancient world interest mingled to produce sons named Asia, Africa, Europe, and America, and twin sons Cyrus and Hannibal. Cyrus Hannibal, a physician, and his wife Anna Livermore settled in Paris Mill, where the doctor did some farming and served as sheriff of Oxford County. Hannibal, named after his paternal uncle, nearly died during his first winter. Tradition has an Indian princess and healer named Molly Ockett traveled through driving snow to save the baby with ointments, healing herbs, and a diet of cow's milk. And Dr. Hamlin was a pediatrician. Young Han grew up surrounded by forests, streams, and mountains and came to know them well. He grew up tall and muscular, with black hair and eyes and extremely swarthy complexion. Okay, so the first thing I noticed was the names given by Hannibal's father to his children. Okay, those names are names that a black man would give his kids. I'm not trying to be stereotypical, but come on, Asia, Africa, Europe, and America, those are not names given by white fathers to their kids. I'm just saying. Not to mention the name Hannibal, who was also a black man in history. All right, and the second thing, and the most obvious, was Hannibal's description of having an extremely swarthy complexion. Okay, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to interpret that adjective. All right, so I was also thinking, how could so many American people, when Hamlin was vice president, not know what he looked like in 1861? Well, I believe it was due to the fact that it was 1861. What I mean is that traveling was by horse, buggy, boat, etc. The first transcontinental railway was not completed until 1869, and I'm sure it wasn't the safest mode of travel at that point. So what I'm trying to say is, if Hamlin didn't travel to the majority of the US, people would have to rely on what newspapers reported. Also, the Civil War was started in 1861, so that's why you can see all the uproar in Southern newspapers about his dark complexion and Hannibal being called black or a nigger. All right, so let's look at some sources of evidence, and the first one is going to be from the Senate.gov website, and it goes on to read, during the campaign, both Lincoln and Hamlin considered it prudent to make no speeches. However, Hamlin assured Lincoln, while I have been silent, I have never been so busy through the press and by personal effort endeavoring to strengthen the weak points all along the line. After Maine Republicans swept the September elections, Hamlin traveled to Boston in October to march in a torchlight parade, accompanied by Maine lumberjacks, Penobscot Indians, and party stalwarts. One of the favorite signs combined the ticket into a single name, Abra Hamlin Kun. On a less friendly note, Southerners denounced Lincoln and Hamlin as radical abolitionists. Going even further, Robert Barnwell Rhett, editor of the Charleston Mercury, wrote that Hamlin is what we call a mulatto. He has black blood in him. An amused New Yorker, George Templeton Strong, observed that Hamlin seemed a vigorous specimen of the pure Yankee type. His complexion is so swarthy that I cannot wonder at the demented South for believing him a mulatto. So basically what he's saying is that he doesn't blame the Southerners for thinking that Hamlin was black because he was so dark-skinned. And again, let me point out that this information is on the Senate.gov website, okay, and it's talking about Hamlin being black. So why don't we have this information as common knowledge in our schools? At the least, it should be discussed. All right, so my next piece of evidence is from a newspaper clipping from the Wichita Daily Eagle, dated July 15th, 1891. And as you can see there, it says, the name of Hannibal Hamlin recalls those medals issued during the campaign of 1860. They contained ambrotype portraits of the candidates. On most of them, Mr. Hamlin was given such a swarthy complexion that perhaps these very medals confirmed the belief in the lie industriously circulated in the South that one of his parents was a mulatto, and that he was named in honor of the great Carthaginian to blazon his African descent before the world. At all events, thousands of people in the South actually believed that Lincoln and a nigger were the Republican candidates. Okay, so here's my thing. If these medals or these little ambrotype portraits of the candidates were being given out during the campaign of 1860, and Hamlin's complexion was very swarthy, the reason being is that his complexion actually was swarthy, so it makes sense. And you can see that through the evidence that I've given you and will give you in the next few minutes. What it does tell me is that there was a lot of misinformation going around back then, and this was right around the Civil War, so that's understandable. What's funny and ironic is that this misinformation is what I'm talking about with this whole subject, okay? And this misinformation that I'm talking about has been going on for a long time, which is why I blame the Wilson administration for all this misinformation we're dealing with and trying to decipher today. All right, so let's move on to another source, and this is an excellent source. This one is from Indiana University, Oakleaf Lincoln Collection, Lilly Library. And what we're looking at right now is a compilation of essays compiled by William Cagle for the library in 1992. All right, so first from page 40, it goes on to read, and I quote, "Both men freely expressed their views on slavery and other sensitive issues. Both men were considered radicals. They were opposed in the election of 1860 by 3 other sets of candidates. Together, these candidates received over 1 million more votes than Lincoln and Hamlin together, but their opponents' votes were divided between 3 sets of candidates. A History of the Presidential Elections, page 180. During the election, a rumor was spread that Hamlin had African blood due in part to his swarthy complexion. The Dictionary of American Biography, page 197. Given the times, that may have had an adverse effect on Hamlin's candidacy. All right, so let's go to the second reference, and that's from page 53. And it says, looking again at Lincoln's coffin, Hamlin could have remembered how he felt about slavery when he was vice president. It was the stand against the extension of slavery that made him resign from the Senate and leave the Democratic Party. Weisenberg, 36. Hamlin told a crowd in Boston, "There is in this struggle but a single issue, liberty against slavery. It is no longer of abolition in the South, but it is whether slavery shall not be extended over the whole North." Weisenberg, 36. Hamlin felt his position on slavery was important. "I was urging him," Hamlin recalled. "He was holding back. I desired to arm the blacks and to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But Lincoln refused to budge." Weisenberg, 41. Hamlin would have also remembered the cruel mudslinging during the campaign. Southerners called him a mulatto, Barker, 96. An editor from South Carolina accused Hannibal Hamlin publicly of being a man with colored blood, Barsman, 105. It was true that Hamlin had a dark complexion, but he was not black. It goes on further to say that it was said that the reason no one killed President Lincoln was because they were afraid of Hamlin becoming president, Barsman, 104. However, others felt that Hamlin was better fit to be president than Lincoln, Barsman, 104. All right, so I'm going to take issue with that section that says, it was true that Hamlin had a dark complexion, but he was not black. All right, so we've read that not only did he have a dark complexion, he was extremely swarthy in complexion. So it's not a reach that the man was black. I don't know what people are thinking, except to say that it really highlights that white supremacist viewpoint to think that a person with dark skin couldn't be black. I mean, we had Barack Obama as president already, and he wasn't a very dark-skinned black man. He was actually a light-skinned black man, but he was still a black man. So I don't get it. But as I mentioned, these authors I'm quoting did not see black men and women of European heritage as black people. So I hope you're starting to understand what I'm trying to tell you and what is clear, at least in my mind. Okay, so from the same collection of essays, let's look at another reference. Let's go to page 68, and I'll show you here. And it says, Lincoln and Hamlin were similar in many ways. They both had dark complexions and were men of impressive physique. Also, their ideas about slavery were similar, but Hamlin's ideas were much more radical. Both were honest, hardworking men. Though Lincoln and Hamlin were both popular before their election, they had never met before. They met soon after the election, and it was obvious that this would be one of the few president-vice president relationships that was also a friendship. Even from the beginning, Lincoln put forth trust in Hamlin and a fair amount of power too. As Lincoln got to know Hamlin, he saw Hamlin's wisdom and took his advice in great heed. During the time between their election and their inauguration, they got to know each other. And they also got to see what they would have to overcome as head of our fading country. Lincoln and Hamlin were not liked by many Southerners, so every decision they made would be crucial if they were to prevent war. Prevention of war was nearly impossible, but careful decision-making was still necessary. No matter what they did, they were always scorned by many. They were often misrepresented, and rumors about them were vile and rampant. They were called black Republicans, nigger worshippers, and fanatics. Lincoln was called man-ape and Southern renegade. Hamlin was called mulatto and Democratic traitor. Hamlin had a swarthy complexion but was called a mulatto in the belief that he had black blood in him. Because of his change of parties, some of the Democratic political leaders promoted these rumors even though they knew them to be false, to get even with Hamlin. Okay, first of all, they mentioned that both Lincoln and Hamlin had similar dark complexions. Can anyone watching tell me of anyone that you know that has a dark complexion and they are considered white? I've been living a long time and I have never seen a black-white person. However, I have seen dark black and brown people that had the status of being white, and that would be people from India. Until the 1970s, they were categorized as white, even though they were being discriminated against in the US for looking black. There is actually a good article explaining how the US federal government addressed the situation back in the 1970s. The results were the people from India are now classified as Asian Indians. So this really brings home my point. The same thing occurred earlier in American history. It just happened with black Europeans. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, white supremacy has hidden and omitted this information from 99% of the US population, and it has been propagated around the world. Okay, so just a few more quotes from the essay collection. As you can see here on page 76 and 77, it says, in 1836, the town of Hampden sent him to the state legislature for 5 years. 3 of them spent as Speaker of the lower house. Hamlin acquired his nickname Carthaginian of Maine from a debate during his first term in the state legislature. An opponent made a comment about Hamlin's unusually dark complexion, whence Hamlin proceeded to give the veteran speaker a good tongue lashing. In the twilight of his career, Hamlin was known as the Old Carthaginian. All right, so let's move on to page 159, and it says, first, Hannibal Hamlin was a radical Republican, born and raised in Maine. He grew up with strong abolitionist sentiments. He had won elections in the past partly on his strong anti-slavery stand. However, in the national arena, his flexibility on the issue of slavery appealed to Southern states. Southern newspaper editors attacked him, sometimes on the basis of his racial background. Hamlin had a rather dark complexion. One editor from South Carolina remarked bitterly, "The black Republicans have put a renegade Southron on one side of the president, and they put a man of colored blood on the other side of the ticket for vice president of the United States." Barsman 105. The reference to Lincoln as a renegade Southron, of course, refers to his birth in Kentucky. All right, so moving on to page 166 and 167, and it goes on to read, Senator Hamlin was a tall, comely figure with black, piercing eyes and such a dark complexion that it was rumored he had Negro blood, which accounted for his radical reputation in the Senate when it came to slavery. Sandberg 3, 155. In the tiny village of Paris in Maine, 1809, he was born. Hamlin, as Lincoln did, grew up a lover of books. His father was a leading man in the community and made sure that Hamlin received an excellent education. Hamlin studied at the Hebron Academy, and he became a prominent man of law in his area by the age of 24. Okay, so most of those quotes speak for themselves. All right, so let's get one more source, and that will be from a publication created by the U.S. Senate Historical Office, printed and authenticated by the Government Printing Office, edited by Wendy Wolf in 1997. It's called The Vice Presidents of the United States, 1789 to 1993. All right, so there are 2 references that interest me. The first one is from page 129, and it's referencing Vice President Richard Johnson, and he was the Vice President to Van Buren. And it goes on to say, Kendall wrote with such consternation that Johnson's companion, a young Delilah of about the complexion of Shakespeare's swarthy Othello, was said to be his 3rd wife, his second, which he sold for her infidelity, having been the sister of the present lady. Although one of the most fashionable in Kentucky, Johnson's resort also formed a source of considerable embarrassment for the administration. All right, so the only thing I'm pointing out there is that Johnson had a wife, apparently, that was the complexion of Shakespeare's swarthy Othello. And if you look up Othello, he's considered to be a dark-skinned African man. All right, so moving on to the second quote from the Senate Historical Office's publication. And this quote concerns Vice President Hamlin on page 206, and it goes on to read, On a less friendly note, Southerners denounced Lincoln and Hamlin as a radical abolitionists. Going even further, Robert Barnwell Rhett, editor of the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury, wrote that Hamlin is what we call a mulatto. One of the reasons I bring up these two quotes is that this document was created in 1997 in the U.S. Senate Historical Office. So they're mentioning these two people that were black or mulatto people. And yet again, we don't talk about it, but of course that information is there and people know it. They just don't want to have to explain it. What is also weird is that of all the hundreds of newspapers throughout the country in the 1860s, I can only find maybe 15 references to Vice President Hamlin's appearance via online multiple archival newspaper websites. And the same can be said for Abraham Lincoln's appearance. There were just a few references to him being accused of being black. Interesting. You should be asking yourselves, why isn't this information discussed frequently today? Why is Barack Obama considered the first black president? Why is Kamala Harris considered the first black person nominated for vice president for a major political party? All right, your mental juices should be flowing by now. All right, so we're on to my next prominent black American, and that would be Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson was born on the 13th of November, 1850, and he died on December 3rd, 1894. He was a Scottish novelist, poet, travel writer, most noted for Treasury Island, the book Kidnapped, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and A Child's Garden of Verses. He was born and educated in Edinburgh. Stevenson suffered from serious bronchial trouble for much of his life, but continued to write prolifically and travel widely in defiance of his poor health. As a young man, he mixed in London literary circles, receiving encouragement from Andrew Lang, Edmund Goose, Leslie Stephen, and W.E. Henley, the last of whom he may have provided the model for Long John Silver in Treasure Island. In 1890, he settled in Samoa, where he died in 1894. A celebrity in his lifetime, Stevenson's critical reputation has fluctuated since his death. Though today his works are held in general acclaim, he is currently ranked as the 26th most translated author in the world. As I mentioned before, Stevenson was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, to Thomas Stevenson, a leading lighthouse engineer, and his wife Margaret Isabel, born Balfour. He was christened Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson. At the age of 18, he changed the spelling of Lewis, L-E-W-I-S, to Louis, L-O-U-I-S, and dropped the Balfour in 1873. All right, so I've given you some background on Robert Louis Stevenson. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the references I'd like to bring your attention to and why I believe that he is a black man. All right, so this reference comes from the Invisible Heroes manuscript, written by Roy H. Williams, and is a collection of more than 100 biographical stories. All right, so I'm going to go to the number 36 story, and that is the biography of Sam Longhorn Clemens, aka Mark Twain. And what it says here is Clemens is introducing his daughter to Robert Louis Stevenson, and it goes on to say, one of the high points in Sam's life came when he was introduced to Robert Louis Stevenson, the celebrity author of Treasure Island. In a letter home to young Susie, Papa Sam described him thusly. He was mostly scantily furnished with flesh. His clothes seemed to fall into hollows, as if there might be nothing inside but the frame for a sculptor's statue. His long face and lank hair and dark complexion and musing and melancholy expression seemed to fit these details just and harmoniously. And altogether, if it seemed especially planned to gather the rays of your observation and focalize them upon Stevenson's special distinction and commanding feature, his splendid eyes. They burned with a smoldering rich fire under the penthouse of his eyebrows, and they made him beautiful. All right, so as we can all see, Mr. Clemens, aka Mark Twain, described Stevenson as having a dark complexion. All right, so my next reference from a book called Robert Louis Stevenson in California by Catherine D. Osborne, written in 1911, and we're going to go to pages 36 and 37. All right, so you can see there on page 36 at the bottom it says, he was tall and thin naturally and emaciated by illness. His hair was light. All right, moving on to page 37, it continues, brown and down on his neck. His complexion olive but rich tinted, for he never lost his color even in sickness. And his lips were full red, his manners and gestures were like those of Latin people. All right, so she describes his complexion as being olive, but rich tinted. I don't know if you guys have seen an olive, but I've seen them and they're brown and black. And of course, if a person has a brown complexion, they're not going to lose their color even if they're sick. All right, so I want you to take a look at a picture that Google has for Mr. Stevenson. Does he remotely have a dark or olive complexion? I think not. And yes, I know you can hear the sarcasm in my voice as this video goes on, but it's really frustrating to read one thing and see another. The other thing that is very frustrating for me and that I've alluded to is that you have all this collection of historically important people that many of us have learned about in school, but no mention of their appearance as it pertains to their complexion. I mean, this is like a big deal to me. I don't see how it's just glanced over and not talked about, and I've told you why I believe that is the case. All right, so getting back to Robert Louis Stevenson, and my last reference for him is from the Project Gutenberg ebook of the life of Mrs. Robert Louis Stevenson by Nellie Vandergrift Sanchez, 1920. All right, so going on to page 13 of that ebook, it says, "My hair was braided in front and my everyday gingham sunbonnet sewn to my hair. This was done in the vain hope of keeping off sunburn, for I was dark, like my mother, and my complexion was the despair of her life. Beauty of the fair blonde type was in vogue then, so that I was quite out of fashion. It was thought that if one was dark, one had a wicked temper. In reality, Fanny, with a clear olive skin, her bright black eyes, her perfectly regular features, and mass of half-curling dark hair, was the prettiest in the family, but the dictates of fashion are imperious. So her mother put lotions on her face, and her grandmother washed it with strong soap, saying, 'She is that color by nature. God made her ugly.' The little girl asked rather pathetically if they would not change her name to Lily, to which her mother replied, 'You are a tiger lily.' In years after, in her many gardens in different parts of the world, there were always tiger lilies growing. She was a high-spirited, daring creature, a little flashing firefly of a child, eagerly seeking for adventure. That might have brought up her frequent punishment were it not that her parents had exceedingly liberal views in such matters." All right, so there are several takeaways from this quote by Mrs. Stevenson. The first one is that Robert Louis Stevenson was not only a black man, but he married a black woman, which makes total sense. Number two, Fanny describes her own complexion as dark, like her mother's. And then the author describes her complexion or her skin color as clear olive. Let's look at a picture of the typical olives that we consume. I have a photo of 3 colors of olives here, you can see. And we all know that the color green is not a human complexion, obviously. So that leaves the colors brown and almost black. All right, so takeaway number 3, her mother being ashamed of both her own and her daughter's skin color is very sad. But I understand, because white supremacy can make you feel like you don't belong and you have no worth. Her mother put lotions on her face and her grandmother washed her with strong soaps, hoping to lighten her skin. You know, self-loathing is very common in communities of darker complexion people. And it's truly sad. All right, so the 4th takeaway, in the end, she married a famous black author. So I guess her life wasn't too bad. All right, so these next references were from a book called The Portrait and Biographical Record of Randolph, Jackson, Perry, and Monroe counties of Illinois. It contains sketches of prominent and representative citizens of the counties, together with biographies and portraits of all the presidents of the United States and the governors of the state of Illinois. And this was published in 1894. All right, so this reference I'm going to give you right now is just as a comparison to the other ones that I'm going to give you. So on page 28, we're going to be talking about Thomas Jefferson, and it starts off, in person, Mr. Jefferson was tall and thin, rather above 6 feet in height, but well formed. His eyes were light, his hair, originally red, in after life became white and silvery. His complexion was fair, his forehead broad, and his whole countenance intelligent and thoughtful. Okay, so like I said, I read that description of Mr. Jefferson just as a comparison of the ones I'm going to read you. And Mr. Jefferson, obviously, according to this, has a fair complexion. All right, so this next reference I'm going to read to you is about Shadrach Bond. And in 1818, Mr. Bond was elected the first governor of the state of Illinois. All right, so moving on to page 114, right there at the bottom, you can see it says Mr. Bond was of a benevolent and convivial disposition, a man of shrewd observation and clear appreciation of events. His person was erect, standing 6 feet in height, and after middle life became portly, weighing 200 pounds. His features were strongly masculine, complexion dark, hair jet, and eyes hazel. Was a favorite with the ladies. He died on April 11th, 1830, in peace and contentment. All right, so you can see that Mr. Bond is described as having a dark complexion with jet hair. Now, jet, if you look that up, that means black. All right, so let's move on to the next reference, and that would be Joseph Duncan. All right, so he was governor of Illinois from 1834 through 1838. And moving on to page 132, it says, Governor Duncan was a man of rather limited education, but with naturally fine abilities, he profited greatly by his various public services and gathered a store of knowledge regarding public affairs which served him a ready purpose. He possessed a clear judgment, decision, confidence in himself, and moral courage to carry out his convictions of right. In his deportment, he was well adapted to gain the admiration of the people. His intercourse with them was both affable and dignified. His portrait of the governor's mansion, from which the accompanying was made, represents him as having a swarthy complexion, high cheekbones, broad forehead, piercing black eyes, and straight black hair. Now here I've included a picture from the book of Governor Duncan, and I definitely don't see a swarthy complexion. And I guarantee you, if I went to the governor's mansion or wherever they had this portrait today, he's definitely not going to have a swarthy complexion. And again, what's that old saying? Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. All right, so moving on to the next governor of Illinois, and that would be Thomas Ford. And he was the governor of Illinois from 1842 to 1846. And we're moving on to page 140. And it says, Mr. Ford had not the brass of the ordinary politician, nor that impetuosity which characterizes a political leader. He cared little for money and hardly enough for a decent support. In person, he was of small stature, slender, of a dark complexion, with black hair, sharp features, deep-set eyes, a pointed aquiline nose having a decent twist to one side, and a small mouth. All right, so you can see the picture I have here of Mr. Ford that they have in the book, and again, no dark complexion. And that's why I contrasted Thomas Jefferson in the same book, and as you can see a picture of him, and of course he has a fair complexion. So where is the actual contrast in complexion? Anyway, let's move on to my next reference, and that would be William M. Bissell. And he was governor of Illinois from 1857 to 1860. And as you can see here on page 151. All right, so it says, in stature, he was somewhat tall and slender, and with a straight military bearing, he presented a distinguished appearance. His complexion was dark, his head well poised, though not large, his address pleasant and manner winning. He was exemplary in his habits, a devoted husband and kind parent. He was twice married, the first time to Miss James, moving on to page 152, and it continues, of Monroe County, by whom he had 2 children, both daughters. She died soon after the year 1840, and Mr. B married for his second wife a daughter of Elias K. Kane, previously a United States Senator from this state. She survived him but a short time and died without issue. All right, so before I move on to my next governor, I'm going to put a picture up here of William M. Bissell, and I don't think he has a dark complexion. What do you think? Okay, so moving on to my next governor is going to be Joseph W. Pfeiffer, and he was elected governor of Illinois on November 6th, 1888, and we're moving on to page 184. Okay, so it says, Mr. Pfeiffer was married in 1870 to Gertie, daughter of William J. Lewis of Bloomington. Mr. Pfeiffer is 6 feet in height and is spare, weighing only 150 pounds. He has a swarthy complexion, keen black eyes, quick movement, and possesses a frank and sympathetic nature. All right, so here's a picture of Joseph W. Pfeiffer, and again, I don't see a swarthy complexion. All right, so my next reference in this book is going to be General John Logan, and of course he's not a governor, but let's move on to page 203. All right, so it says General John A. Logan was born in Franklin County, Illinois in 1824. He entered military service as captain in the Mexican War and served for 2 years. At the beginning of the Civil War, he espoused the cause of the Union and entered the voluntary service in 1861. When he raised and commanded the 31st Illinois Infantry. At the Battle of Belmont, Missouri, he led his men into the fight with great gallantry. Though they were raw troops and had never stood fire, yet they fought on this occasion under the lead of Colonel Logan with a bravery seldom surpassed by veteran soldiers. All right, so we're going to move on to page 204, and we're still referencing General Logan. And it says, at the close of the Civil War, General Logan resigned his position and retired to civic life. Though from that time until his death, December 26, 1886, he was closely associated with the history of Illinois and the United States as well. In person, he was a remarkable man, resembling no other general. His complexion was dark, his eyes and hair very black, and in stature he was low and heavy. He wore his hair and mustache long, which increased his resemblance to the Indian chiefs of the western wilds. All right, so you can see a picture here of General Logan, and I don't see a dark complexion. And the other interesting note about him is that they said he resembled no other general. I wonder why. All right, so that was some very interesting insight into the state of Illinois and who was in charge and running things in that state, at least in the early 1800s. And according to history that we've been taught, all the black people were enslaved picking cotton. So, interesting. Anyway, trust me, I don't think the state of Illinois is alone in this. I think many more states had black governors and legislators. The problem is that information has been hidden and destroyed. Okay, so there are hundreds more prominent Americans that you thought were white or had fair complexions. However, if I covered them all, this video would go on forever. What I'm going to do is list many more individuals that are written about as having dark or swarthy complexions. If you feel so inclined, please research them on your own. Remember, the key to rediscovering who was black, brown, or shallow is to search in the text for their complexion, countenance, hue, or skin color. When I search for those keywords I just mentioned, I type them into the Google search bar. Or if I have a PDF document, I press Control F and I search for those terms: complexion, countenance, hue, or skin color, or skin. All right, so I just wanted to add this into the mix as further proof as to what I'm saying. All right, so the title of this newspaper clipping is "A White Man Sold into Slavery." It was published in the Vermont Phoenix newspaper on April 4th, 1857, and it goes on to read, "A white man sold into slavery. The Buffalo Express learns that a young man named Barnhart, the son of an early immigrant to Linden, Cattaraugus County, from the Mohawk Dutch settlements, has been sold as a slave by a company of strolling play actors, with whom he engaged to travel in December last. Young Barnhart is an excellent player on the violin and accompanied the actors into Maryland and Virginia in the capacity of a musician. He was of rather dark complexion, and his companions, representing him to be a Negro, sold him to some Virginia slave denier. The evidence of this was doubted at first, but is now believed to be true. and Barnhart's father was making preparations to seek for and rescue his enslaved son. All right, so when I first read this clipping, I immediately thought about the movie 12 Years a Slave. However, the main discrepancy with that movie is that in this instance, the kidnapped son is considered white. That movie didn't mention that individual being white or considered white. Now, I realize this was not the only kidnapping of a black musician back then, but it does help prove what I'm saying, which is black people with proven European heritage were perceived as white. This father and son were from a Mohawk Dutch settlement in upstate New York. Furthermore, the musicians that sold him passed Barnhart off as a Negro, which meant, ta-da, he looked like a Negro. Also, the editor of the paper never mentioned that it was weird that Barnhart could be passed off as a Negro, even though he was considered white, which in my opinion means this was normal during that era. Anyway, I thought you'd find this interesting. Okay, so I want to give you a small list of additional Americans we were all taught were of a fair complexion or AKA white. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are so many more. But if I listed them all, this video would be 100 hours long. Anyway, starting off the list, as you can see, we have President Warren G. Harding, Senator Thomas Corwin, President Thomas Jefferson, referred to as a half N-word. Then we have Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. We have Senator Samuel Chase. I have Governor Varnum of Mississippi, poet Edgar Allan Poe, Virginia statesman William Branch Giles, businessman William Randolph Hearst, Senator of Indiana General John Tipton, the Borden girls, as in Lizzie Borden and her sister, privateer John Paul Jones, Senator William K. Sebastian, George Vanderbilt, son of the famed Vanderbilt family, Congressman Benjamin Huntington, President of Congress, President Andrew Jackson and his wife Rachel Donaldson, preacher Benjamin Trumbull, President Rutherford B. Hayes' wife Lucy Webb, which was her maiden name, Senator and Judge Ira Harris, Michael Davitt, famous Irish leader, Patsy O'Leary, boxer, Indian fighter Daniel Boone, Sam Franounce, as in Black Sam, he was a famous tavern owner, Senator W.C. Reeves, Postmaster General John H. Regan, Secretary of the Treasury George M. Bibb, as in B-I-B-B. And as I said before, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to list all the prominent Americans that were black. Although, I hope I've inspired you to look into it on your own, or at least stay tuned until I release my next video. Down the rabbit hole we go. Alright, so I'd like to conclude this video with a few words and some observations. So first off, due to the control of information in the United States, much of the obvious literature that I'm looking for has been destroyed, omitted, republished under new volumes, or hidden by private historical societies and libraries, etc. Of course, this is my opinion. However, it is based off of all the information I've researched. And as you can see, I'm not making this stuff up. What I can tell you is that much of the information that is left is coded language. Meaning, as I told you before, you have to look for keywords to determine someone's ethnicity. What I've also realized through my research is when I read the word white referring to people's complexions prior to the 1940s, they could be talking about people with dark or fair complexions. The term was ambiguous. I hope I have shown that to you via all the people that I have covered and will cover in this video, along with the others I have featured in my other videos. The individuals I covered obviously are just a very small sample, as I said before. Another conclusion, we as modern day American citizens have been lied to by the government, academia, family, and relatives that were alive and participated in this contrived charade. I truly believe that the majority of this deceit and deception occurred during Woodrow Wilson's 2 terms in office, or at least he started it off. I want to read you this quote again from the current president of Princeton University, Christopher Eisgruber, and it goes on to read, "Wilson's racism was significant and consequential even by the standards of his own time. He segregated the federal civil service after it had been racially integrated for decades, thereby taking America backward in its pursuit of justice. He not only acquiesced in, but added to the persistent practice of racism in this country, a practice that continues to do harm today. All right, and the second quote from President Eisgruber goes on to say, I quote, "Princeton is part of an America that has too often disregarded, ignored, or excused racism, allowing the presence of systems that discriminate against Black people." All right, so what I want you to pay attention to are some of the words that Eisgruber used in his quote, and those are, Wilson's racism was significant and consequential even by the standards of his own time. Okay, what that means to me is that Wilson went above and beyond to try to suppress and inflict harm on the Black community. All right, so the second part of Eisgruber's statement that I want you to listen to is, I quote, "allowing the persistence of systems that discriminate against Black people." And again, to me, those systems are still in place today. You know, honestly, it's clear to me how this wholesale deceit to cover up and hide Black people's history in the United States could occur on a mass scale. But you may be asking yourself, I'm still not convinced. Well, let me show you by simply explaining what President Trump is doing today. He's on a personal mission to eradicate anything President Obama did during his 8 years in office. Trump has removed almost all of Obama's executive orders, cabinet-level decisions, congressional review acts, and Trump is also actively trying to totally remove the Affordable Care Act. Here is a Washington Times article from January 20th, 2018. I'm not going to read it, but I want you to go ahead and take a look at it because it's a very interesting read and it kind of goes over Trump's obsession with getting rid of anything Obama ever did. So that is my example of a president that can change history, destroy history, lie about history. I mean, Trump has lied over 20,000 times. And that's not me saying that. That's me quoting the fact checkers on the news. So I definitely think it's possible, especially during the 1920s, that, without cameras and people really watching and on the news and social media, that a president with his power could get rid of or change that information. I mean, as I told you before, Wilson instituted his own series of history books throughout the United States. The man was clearly on a mission to institute his vision of history and how it should look. And another sad fact is the majority of the countries around the world are holding up and espousing this perverse lie, acquiescing and perpetrating it for the sake of holding on to power via white supremacist views and falsehoods. I guess you can hear how disturbed I am to learn all this information. I hope you folks are listening and can understand the gravity of this information. Our society has used it for leverage and power since the late 1800s. What makes it even more disturbing is that most of this information is in libraries that history professors have access to and knowledge of. But again, if they were to reveal this information, people would demand change, and then, God forbid, everyone would have to compete equally for jobs and other resources. Reparations for the wrongdoings done would have to be paid. The historical record will be righted, and fair-complexioned people will have to admit their false sense of who they are in history, not being able to lay claim to all the dark-complexioned people throughout history as being AKA white people. Not an easy pill to swallow, but absolutely the right thing to do. Well, I hope you find this information enlightening, fascinating, and life-changing. If you are enjoying these videos, please like and subscribe to my channel.